Our speaker for tonight is the Reverend Dr. Susan Andrews, a wonderful, wonderful gift from our own community. She is the parish associate and theologian in residence at Webster Groves Presbyterian Church. She's had decades of experience as a pastor, including working on staff on the presbytery level here in Giddings-Lovejoy, and also as Presbytery Leader General, Presbyter of Hudson River Presbytery. So of her many accomplishments, another one I wanted to lift up is that she was the moderator of the 215 General Assembly for the PCUSA and has decades of experience in this particular area of advocacy around addressing gun violence. And today I understand that she has partnered with our friends from the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, particularly with Reverend Jan or Harder, moderator of the Gun Violence Prevention Working Group of the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, who has some policies and resources to share. So I want to thank you all for this timely and critical conversation at this particular time, especially as we are still reeling from the gun violence at the Central Visual and Performing Arts High School in the city. So this event was hosted, brought to you here by the Public Witness team. And at the very end, there will be space for them to make themselves known here and to reiterate anything else that we wanted to say about action plans and next steps. So as we know, this conversation takes a lot of work, and it starts and continues right here. It's my pleasure to hand it over to Susan Andrews. If you could lead us off with prayer and get us started, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. I appreciate your introduction, and greetings to all of you in the name of Jesus Christ. Let me begin by saying that I am not an expert on this issue, but I am a mother and a grandmother, and I care deeply about this growing problem in our nation. And I did have an experience, which I will briefly talk about later, in the Presbytery of Hudson River, where I served as General Presbyter. And that was the presbytery that brought to the General Assembly the overture following Sandy Hook that set up all of our gun prevention statements as a denomination. So I was sort of involved in the grassroots of that, and it caught fire in my own heart. So this is something that I care about. I'm a part of the local Moms Demands Action Group, and we'll talk also a little bit about that as a resource. So let me begin with prayer, and let me give credit where credit is due. This is a prayer that comes from the Episcopal Peace Fellowship. Let us pray. Gracious God, inspire us with the gift of shalom, the gift of wholeness, and the promise of your presence. Give us wisdom to seek nonviolence as an answer to the violence of our lives and world. Give us courage to seek wholeness in a fractured and divided world, to find reconciliation rather than revenge, to abandon the instruments of violence and death, and entrust our lives, our homes, and our families to you. May your presence fill us and others with the thirst for unity, wholeness, and the desire to see all people valued as created in your image. May we and others receive your shalom, that we might be faithful instruments of your love and your peace. Amen. So I'm going to ask Janice to move us into our PowerPoint. And I want to thank Janice McMillan for taking some notes I sent her and turning it into a PowerPoint. So we are going to begin that now. And again, tonight, we're looking at gun violence prevention, and specifically, what can congregations do? Next slide, please. So I want to begin with the fact that obviously, as followers of Jesus and as Christians, we are called to be peacemakers. And we all know the scriptural foundation for this commitment that we have. Obviously, 2 of the 10 commandments. One is thou shalt not kill. We have a foundation in our scriptures, both in the 10 commandments. Also, blessed are the peacemakers, straight from the Sermon on the Mount, which I'm currently studying with a wonderful group of women at Webster Groves. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. The Confession of 1967, which some of you are old enough to remember, caused quite a ripple in our denomination in the mid-60s, when we were called as Presbyterians and as Christians to be ambassadors of reconciliation based on Paul's letter to the 2 Corinthians chapter 4, because Christ has come to reconcile a broken world to God. As followers of Jesus and as children of God, our main calling is to be ambassadors of reconciliation in whatever sphere of life we might find ourselves. There is, of course, that wonderful passage in Colossians that Christ has come to break down the walls of hostility. And if we look at the Hebrew scriptures, particularly the Torah and the prophets, we know that what God calls us to do in community is to put the well-being of all, the common good, the well-being of the community over the well-being of any individual. And this is in many ways countercultural, because we live in an individualistic society. But as Christians who follow Jesus, we are called to lift up the well-being of the community. And that certainly is true when it comes to issues of violence. And then finally, throughout the entire scriptures, and particularly in the letters of Paul and in the teachings of Jesus, we learn about Christian freedom. Again, a buzzword in today's world. But Christian freedom is freedom for the other. It is not freedom from responsibility, but freedom for responsibility to love our neighbors and to build up the reign of God. And Christian freedom is not, in the Christian tradition, underscoring self-indulgence. So these are just a few ways that our scripture and our tradition and our Presbyterian faith call us to care about gun violence. We don't care about it because it's a political issue. We care about it because it's part of our Christian calling to take seriously issues of violence that are getting out of hand in our culture. Next slide, please. So many of you know that the Presbyterian Church, through its process of overtures and General Assembly actions, the Office of Social Witness Policy, and also those various other agencies of our denomination, again and again and again, study carefully social and cultural issues through the lens of Scripture in order to come up with policies and responses as faithful Christians. And one of the clear points to be made is that gun violence is health issue, and nobody articulates this better than Nicholas Kristof, if any of you have read some of his opinion pieces and research papers in the New York Times. The focus of our time together tonight will be about gun safety, not gun control. This is not an anti-Second Amendment issue or denial, but rather how can we have sensible gun laws in order to be able to cut down on the violence, protect our children and our young people, and care about the common good. We will consider strategies that both gun owners and those who do not own guns can agree upon. And the analogy, which has often been used, but I think it's worth lifting up again. In 1921, car safety laws and requirements began to slowly become the standard. As cars became more and more prevalent, there were more and more accidents. There were more and more people being reckless with their vehicles. So over the years, as we know, I can certainly track this in my own life. I never knew what a seatbelt was when I was a child or a teenager. But in today's world, we have seatbelts, licensing requirements, speed limits, equipment requirements, etc., that we all now take for granted and that we are grateful for. Cars were not outlawed when all of this happened, but they were manufactured and controlled for safety, reducing the death rate by 95% since 1921. So that's sort of an analogy of those who are talking about gun violence prevention and about gun safety, is how can we take this cultural phenomenon and make it safe through regulation, through licensing, through training, through community agreement. And so that's kind of one of the metaphors that we can think about as we think about how we might move forward in terms of gun violence prevention. So let's move on to the next slide.
We need rescue inside the auditorium, multiple victims.
The United States has a problem with gun violence.
We hold the victims in our hearts.
Perhaps we may never fully understand it.
A man with a semi-automatic weapon.
We talk about it after mass shootings, but it's much larger and more complicated than those debates allow.
That is not accurate.
Here's what you need to know about the state of gun violence in America. It's true that the US sees many more mass shootings than these other developed countries. Between 2000 and 2014, there were 133 mass shootings in public populated places. That's excluding gang violence and terrorism. Of course, the US is a much larger country, but if you adjust for population size, it still ranks higher. Of these countries, Finland is next, with just 2 shootings over 14 years, but a much, much smaller population. And this type of tragedy seems to be happening more often in the US. Each of these squares represents a public mass shooting with 4 or more fatalities. Before 2011, they happened 6 months apart on average. But since then, only 2 months go by between them.
I hope and pray that I don't have to come out again during my tenure as president to offer my condolences to families in these circumstances.
That was October 1st, 2015. And just about 2 months later,
Yesterday, a tragedy occurred in San Bernardino, and our first order of business is to send our thoughts and prayers to the families of those who've been killed.
public mass shootings get all the attention because they're often so indiscriminate. But the truth is, mass shootings are unlike most gun deaths in America. Here's how it breaks down. According to the most recent data, 92 people are killed with guns every day on average. About 30 of those are homicides, of which maybe 1.5 at most can be considered part of mass shootings. Most of those killed, 58 people a day, are suicides. The rest are accidental shootings, police actions, and undetermined incidents. Those suicides, they show up in international comparisons too. These are the 10 countries ranked highest on human development by the UN. The US has the highest suicide rate among them, and this darker bar shows how many of those are with guns. Some people think suicide isn't really relevant to the gun issue.
But to go and think that some type of gun control regulations that are being talked about are going to stop somebody from committing suicide when there's so many other ways for people to commit suicide.
But the methods that people use are important because suicide attempts often stem from temporary crises. The vast majority of people who survive suicide attempts don't end up dying from suicide, but guns make it nearly impossible to get that second chance. The victims of gun suicides are overwhelmingly men and mostly white. And the rate of gun suicides has been increasing in the US. At the same time, the rate of gun homicides has been decreasing, especially since the 90s when crime rates in general were higher. But if you compare the US to other developed countries, it doesn't look like good news. These are homicides adjusted for population size. The US would probably have a higher homicide rate even without guns, but you can see how gun violence pushes that rate far beyond the other countries here. The victims of these shootings, they're not the ones you often see on the national news. They're disproportionately young black men.
You guys can leave here and go on with your lives, but we gotta go home to empty rooms because our children's lives were taken away by people who should not have had guns anyway.
One possible explanation is that the US simply has more crime than those other countries. But if you set aside homicides for a moment and look at rates of burglary or assault, you don't see that same spike that you see with homicide. It's not that America has much more crime. It's that crime in the US is much more lethal. Altogether, the number of gun deaths in the US from 2000 to 2013 exceeds the number of Americans killed by AIDS, by illegal drug overdoses, the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and terrorism combined. It should be clear by now that this level of gun violence is a uniquely American problem among the developed world. And here's one reason why. There are a ton of guns in the US. This chart shows the estimated number of guns by country. It's adjusted for population size, and it's still not even close.
The question that I would like to ask is how on earth could he compile 13 guns? How can that happen?
If you take a look back at the 10 countries with the highest levels of human development, you can see that it's relatively really easy to get a gun in the US. All of the other countries require a license to purchase most guns, and those purchases are recorded into an official registry. To get that license, people have to state a reason for why they want a gun. And in most of these countries, they have to pass a safety test and are required by law to store their guns safely. In part because of its lax laws, there are well over 300 million guns in the US, and counting. This chart doesn't reflect private sales, but it shows the number of background checks, which all federally licensed dealers have to run. It suggests that the demand for guns has been increasing steeply since Barack Obama took office. So we've looked at gun deaths and at gun ownership. This chart puts them together. It shows that among highly developed countries, the more guns in a country, the more gun deaths. You can see that countries like Switzerland, which have relatively more guns than a country like the Netherlands, also have a higher gun death rate. And here's the US. Likewise, US states with more guns have more gun homicides. There are outliers like Idaho, which has higher rates of gun ownership but low rates of gun murders. But overall, there's a correlation between gun ownership and homicide rates. And that relationship has held up in studies that control for things like poverty, unemployment, and crime. The correlation between gun ownership and gun deaths is even stronger for suicides. It makes sense. Depression with a gun is more dangerous than depression without one. Likewise, fights, domestic disputes, road rage, drunkenness, all much more dangerous with a gun than without. That said, you might need different policies to keep guns away from potential mass shooters than you would to keep them out of inner city gangs or out of the hands of someone who might hurt themselves. America doesn't have a gun problem. It has several of them.
Okay, so that's a kind of a big picture look at the issue. Many of those statistics are 5 or 6 years old, and they would be even more exaggerated today. If we can go back to the PowerPoint, to the next slide. I want to just take some time to look at a few national. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So here are some national statistics, and we don't have to dwell on these, but they sort of give some detail to some of those trends that we saw in the video. In 2020, there were over 44,000 deaths from guns. 60% of those were suicides, which seems to be the breakdown over the years. That's about 10,000 more deaths from guns than just 10 years ago. Since 1970, there have been more deaths from gun violence than all the deaths of all the soldiers in all the wars going back to the Revolutionary War. So when it comes to the tragedy of death and violence, gun violence is even more tragic than war deaths. Americans are 4.4% of the world's population, and we own 42% of the world's guns. 48% of American homes have guns. There are 120 guns for every 100 citizens. And 29% of gun owners own more than 5 guns. All of this is not a judgment, but rather a way of looking at just the volume of the problem when it comes to accessibility to guns in our country. Women who are abused are killed 8 times more often if there is a gun in the house, and suicides are 5 times higher in gun-owning homes. In 2016, the cost of gun violence for the United States economy was $229 billion. And then this I was surprised at and a little scared by. 43% of guns in the United States had no trigger locks or safe storage. And this was a couple of years ago when much of this comes from gun prevention research agencies and some of the major media companies in this country who've done research. 40% of guns, when this study was done, were locked and loaded, ready to go at all times. And 73% of children under 10 know exactly where the guns are in their home. And we have seen the number of children, toddlers, I think there have been 2 or 3 just in the last 3 months here in St. Louis, who have found a gun and started playing with it with tragic results. Okay, next slide, please. Now, so what do people think about some remedies or some ways that this can change? 80% of gun owners and 87% of non-gun owners support universal background checks. So, and that means Republicans and Democrats and independents. So it's not as if it's gun owners versus those who don't own guns, but rather perceptions about what can prevent gun violence. In 2015, 58% of non-owner Americans supported stricter gun laws and 46% of gun owners. And in 2015, 57% of non-owner Americans supported a ban on assault weapons, as opposed to 49% of gun owners. So there is strong support in this nation, not to do away with the Second Amendment, not to say people can't buy guns, but to put safety requirements around gun ownership in terms of who gets the guns, what kind of licensing and training needs to happen, and how guns are handled in the home, all of which seem to be the direction that many people feel we need to go in order to begin to deal with this issue. Next slide, please. Now, that's the national situation, and I'm sure you all could add many other facts and experiences in your own lives. I know that there are those who are watching this evening who are gun owners, those who are not gun owners, those who have close family members who have guns. So again, this is not to say let's take away all the guns, but it's what do we do with this enormous number of lethal weapons that in many cases are not carefully stored or used. So let's turn now to Presbyterian policies. And the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship has been very engaged in this issue, again, starting in right after, I mean, for a long time, but it became one of their priorities after Sandy Hook in 2012. And so they have developed all kinds of resources. They were instrumental in getting the General Assembly to deal with this issue. And at the most recent General Assembly, this last July, there were new decisions made and policies both reinforced and changed. And so I asked Jan Orr Harder, a retired pastor in Texas, who is very invested in this issue. She's the head of the Gun Prevention Task Force. If she would put together a video describing what happened at the General Assembly and what are the policies that have been adopted by our denomination related to gun violence. So that's the video we're going to see now.
Hi, I'm Jan Orr Harder, a retired Presbyterian pastor in Aledo, Texas, and moderator of the Gun Violence Prevention Working Group of the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship. Let's talk about the actions of the 225th Presbyterian General Assembly on the very difficult issue of gun violence prevention. Everything that I'm going to talk about, you can find on this document, on this website, pcbiz.org. Look for the Committee on Addressing Violence in the USA. The Peace Fellowship that I'm part of was founded in 1944 as an independent community of Presbyterians who encourage the peacemaking witness of the church. So we have a memory of many assemblies. This General Assembly in 2022 did a wonderful job of building on nearly 50 years of Presbyterian witness for gun violence prevention. Prior assemblies have mostly supported legislative and advocacy goals, but this assembly focused on very practical steps that congregations and presbyteries and individuals can take at home to prevent gun violence. For those of us who are gun owners, and for those of us who are not gun owners, General Assembly offered all of us very practical steps that we can take to help save American lives. Think of the context that this General Assembly was meeting in. Just in the month before the assembly, there had been a mass shooting in a grocery store in Buffalo, New York, and the shooting at the school in Uvalde, Texas. On June 11th, while the assembly was in session, there were nationwide demonstrations calling for federal action and the first National Safe Surrender Guns to Gardens Day. And during General Assembly, there was the passage of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. This was the first federal action to prevent gun violence in nearly 30 years. So in this swirling context, the General Assembly took 4 major actions. They launched the Presbyterian Decade to End Gun Violence. They took action on gun-related investments in the church. They passed a new protocol to help prevent domestic gun violence, and they supported and strengthened the Guns to Gardens movement. Let's look at each action and see if there is something that calls to you. First, the Decade to End Gun Violence. This was based on a report from the Advisory Committee on Social Witness Policy. The Decade will bring together all parts of the church for a 10-year focus on gun violence prevention. It's a wonderful idea. The Matthew 25 initiative will be expanded to include gun violence prevention. There will be new resources for congregational education and action. There will be funding for things like violence interruption programs and safe green spaces in our cities. And most importantly, there will be a sequel to the film called Trigger by Presbyterian Disaster Assistance. So watch for details about the Presbyterian Decade to End Gun Violence, or just go ahead and get started. Secondly, they took an action on, it was really a commissioner's resolution. It came from out of commissioners out of the Presbytery of Southern New England, which is where the Sandy Hook school shooting happened 10 years ago. This resolution that was passed asked the Mission Responsibility through Investment Office of the PCUSA to engage in dialogue with companies in which the church owns stock to encourage them or convince them to stop selling guns. Currently, we do not hold stock in the manufacture of guns or ammunition. This action also calls for the next assembly to consider whether guns should be a restricted investment category altogether, as are things currently like alcohol, gambling, and tobacco. The third thing they did, it's a little complicated, I want to go into because it's really important. They added to Presbyterian advocacy goals and to local action opportunities a new way to reduce family gun violence or domestic gun violence. The PCUSA General Assembly became one of the first religious bodies to endorse the new Gun Relinquishment Protocol of the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence and Firearms. It's a very long name, but it's very important. The action that the federal government took in June, Congress gives incentive to the states to form red flag laws, which can temporarily remove guns from those who are charged with domestic violence. We know that an abused woman whose abuser has a gun is 400 times more likely to die, often with her children watching. This new protocol is a great project for a presbytery or a group of churches to work to encourage your county or your city or your state to adopt this new protocol for red flag law implementation. Here's how it works. It brings together the courts, law enforcement, social agencies. Everybody comes together at the very beginning of a process to encourage an accused abuser to relinquish any guns they may have. At the very first court session, they are asked, do you have guns to relinquish until your case is resolved? Now, currently, someone who has a felony conviction or a misdemeanor conviction for domestic abuse would be in very serious legal trouble if they were to say, yes, I have guns to relinquish. So now there is an incentive for the abuser to maintain their guns and not relinquish them. The protocol changes that by providing that someone who is charged with abuse can legally surrender their guns without that ever being used against them in a court of law. So if the situation is resolved without a conviction, and if they are not otherwise restricted from owning guns, then they would receive their guns back after a waiting period. So this new protocol is important because it prioritizes the lives of women and children and getting guns out of a crisis situation. There is a group that will be working on this in all 50 states. They're called Moms Demand Action. Moms Demand Action. And you can find them on Facebook. Lastly, the 225th Presbyterian General Assembly became the first major religious body to support the new Guns to Gardens movement. This movement is a new form of direct action to prevent gun violence that has something we can all do to participate. It provides a much needed service to get unwanted guns out of homes and communities without returning them to the gun market where they could do future harm. Guns to Gardens provides a way to safely and legally chop up guns until they are no longer guns and turning the parts into garden tools or art. The GA commended congregations that have already been involved. On that day, on June 11th, 2022, on the first National Safe Surrender Day, those congregations and other groups dismantled over 1,000 unwanted guns of all types, from old rusty rifles to handguns to semi-automatic assault weapons. The GA also encouraged every congregation to prayerfully consider if they are called to participate in Guns to Gardens. In my group, the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, we provide regular action circles so that your congregation can join online with other congregations to learn the best practices for safely and effectively doing Guns to Gardens in your church parking lot. We also provide lots of resources and support. We have this brand new brochure for congregations about Guns to Gardens that you can find on our website. You can always reach us to learn about Guns to Gardens at presbypeacefellowship.org or GVP at Gun Violence Prevention. So if your congregation is like the soldiers in Isaiah 2:4, if you are so tired of the violence that is going on that you are ready to use your own hands to beat swords into plowshares and turn guns into garden tools, get in touch with the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship. In closing, I want to acknowledge that many Presbyterians, including many who participated in these actions at General Assembly, live in states and cities with epidemic levels of gun violence. We must acknowledge that our children and our nation are traumatized by this very real daily fear. Last year, almost 45,000 Americans died from gun violence, and hundreds of thousands were injured or impacted. In 1 year, that's almost as many Americans as died in the entire Vietnam War. In the name of Jesus Christ, your Presbyterian General Assembly has called each of us to search our hearts and to take action on this most difficult of issues. So have courage. I hope that these actions from the Assembly will guide you and your congregation and your presbytery to find your path to helping save lives. The road is long, but together we are going to end the epidemic of gun violence in our country. We have to, because we love one another. After all, we travel this long road with the one who promises in Revelations 21 to wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain. Let us work and live and take action for that day. Thank you for listening. Bye now.
So I have communicated with Jan already our gratitude that she put this together, and obviously she wanted to do it anyway, and it will be used in other places. And this would be an excellent video to use in an adult education class if that is something that you want to do to begin to talk about this issue. Janice, I'd like to go back 2 slides. We skipped the Missouri statistics. I want to take just a look at those. There we go. So we've looked at the national picture. We've looked at the current conversation in our denomination about gun violence and prevention. Let's just take a closer look at where we live. In 2020, Missouri had the 4th highest number of gun violence deaths in the nation, which means, of course, that there were 46 states that had less violence than we did. Missouri is the 41st weakest state in gun safety laws. I've actually read in another resource on Moms Demand Action that we have the weakest of all the states. But in any case, our laws are not very strong in terms of gun safety. In 2020, the St. Louis region had the highest number of gun violence deaths in the nation based on population. That is not an achievement that I think any of us want to be proud about. As of October 25th, St. Louis region, or I'm not sure if this is city or region, I think it's city, had 287 gun violence deaths. That's in 10 months. 197 men, 54 women, and that children's, it's a typo, it's 53 children. And it doesn't quite add up to 287, but it's still a horrendous number of deaths. Obviously, we are all aware of and have been touched by the mass shooting on October 24th at Central Visual and Performing Arts High School in St. Louis City. At Webster Grove, our nursery caregiver, a wonderful member of the church, her niece was in a classroom when this happened and is still going through terrible trauma. And when we listened to the reports and we heard the news, and what everybody said is everything went right in terms of the school security, in terms of parental concern for the shooter, and in terms of the police intervention in a careful, speedy, and appropriate way. But because in Missouri, there is no red flag law, Jan referred to that, which would have allowed the police officers to take the gun away from the disturbed young man when his parents asked them to do so. They did not have the authority because there is no such law in Missouri that allows them to do that. Because there are no universal background checks in Missouri, one gun owner did not give him a gun, but then he was able to go to a private sale to get his gun. And in Missouri, the decision last year to nullify national gun laws so that Missouri state laws trump national gun safety laws. It's those are some of the reasons, along obviously with mental illness and all kinds of other things that we'll be talking about for months and years to come. But that mass shooting, I think, raised the consciousness for many of us, and I know has led to new conversations about security in our congregations, in our sanctuaries, in our nursery schools. It's raised both our fear level and our consciousness level. So given this background of context, of Presbyterian policy, of resources that are out there, let's turn to talking about what we can do in our local congregations. And that is something that Jan started with some of the things that she told us, and we'll get back to some of that. But I want to just tell a couple of stories. I was not in Giddings-Lovejoy Presbytery back in the 2012, whenever the Kirkwood shooting happened, when 6 people were shot dead in Kirkwood, 2 of whom were members at the First Presbyterian Church. And Dave Halloran, who was the pastor at that point, sort of became the town chaplain and had to actually be involved that night with the family of one of the victims who was dying in the hospital. And so that is something that congregation experienced as an enormous tragedy, but also the whole community was just completely upset and concerned about it. The good news out of that story is that Paul Ryder, who was the general presbyter at that time, called David Halloran, the pastor at First Pres Kirkwood, and said, the Presbyterian disaster assistance folks are on their way to help you. And David had no idea what that meant, but representatives from PDA who are trained to deal with domestic terrorist shooting episodes came in to help the staff at First Pres and the community to begin to deal with, to process, to figure out how to work through the feelings that were engendered by this episode. And as a result of that, David Halloran got involved in PDA, and he is now on their disaster response team and goes all over the country because he knows what it felt like to be a pastor. And to be part of a congregation where this happens. And so now he is one who goes around when these things happen in other cities. So that's really a way by which our connectional church can help when these kinds of things happen. I want to tell you the story about the Stony Point Presbyterian Church, which is in the Hudson Valley. That's the presbytery I served from 2006 to 2015. And Sandy Hook took place in 2012. And because Hudson River Presbytery is right next to Southern New England Presbytery, where Sandy Hook is located, we were only maybe 30 miles away from where this happened. It affected many people in our churches because they knew people who lived in Connecticut. Some of them had relationships with people in Sandy Hook. So one of our congregations, Stony Point Presbyterian Church, small congregation across the street from the Stony Point Center, which is one of the conference centers of our denomination. There was a pastor there named Marjorie Rossi, who was very, very concerned. And she wanted her church to talk about this and do something about it, do something to help with the whole issue of gun violence, of gun safety, of how do we have gun laws that can cut down on this kind of slaughter of school children in the 2nd grade. Well, I won't go through, it was a very long process. It took about 2 years. There were people in her congregation who did not want to talk about it. They thought it had nothing to do with their faith. They were gun owners and they felt threatened because they thought they were being blamed. So all of the kinds of feelings and reactions that you might imagine happened in this congregation. And so what they did, the session and the pastor, is they put together an educational process of about 8 weeks, where they looked at a lot of different resources, where they brought in speakers, where they spent a great deal of time studying scripture and talking about Jesus and Jesus's view of peacemaking. And slowly but surely, they began to find some common ground as to what they could do as a congregation. And so they came up with a statement, first of all, which is fairly long, but let me just read a couple of sentences. We, as members of the Stony Point Presbyterian Church, in an effort to model the love and the care of Jesus Christ in the world, commit ourselves to work actively to reduce gun violence in our community and across our nation. We hear Jesus's call to us to be peacemakers and lift up this special concern as we pray, worship, study, and take action. And then they came up and they said, we are of one mind. And this was a congregation of about 100 members. So it took them a while to get here. In a country where 1,000 people are shot by guns each year, resulting in 30,000, it's now 44,000 deaths each year, we will do all that is within our power to stop the madness. And then these are 3 decisions they made. We oppose the proliferation of assault and military style weapons. We support creation and enforcement of laws requiring full background checks. And we condemn and will work to thwart those gun dealers who act irresponsibly by allowing straw buying outside of any kind of regulations. And then they went on to commit to pray, to educate, to work in partnership, and to witness publicly, and to act together to reduce the violence. And the final thing they did is they made the decision to put in their church a sign that says, because we follow Jesus Christ, this is a gun-free zone. And they posted it on all their doors. As a result of that action, the presbytery, hearing about all of this, got interested. Presbytery studied it. Presbytery debated it. Presbytery argued about it, and finally passed an overture that went to that year's General Assembly. And the General Assembly adopted policies and procedures and resource and educational materials around gun violence prevention based on the model that Stony Point started. So it went from a congregation through a presbytery to the denomination. And all of those resources are now on the denominational website. And we will get a screen eventually that will show us what those resources are. So here's the reason I tell this story. Is this how this whole movement in our denomination started? With a 100-member congregation that had blue collar as well as professional members who were divided about the issue when they started. And after prayer, worship, study, and action, they were able to reach consensus and make a difference. So that's one story, and including the Hudson River Presbytery. And then let me just share what's been happening at Webster Groves in the last 3 or 4 years. About 3 or 4 years ago, the very active Mission Commission, as is the case in many presbyteries, but there was a particular group of folks at Webster Groves who really wanted to start dealing with advocacy, really looking at public policy and justice issues through the lens of the Bible and through the lens of Presbyterian social witness policy. So an advocacy team was created. They spent a long time creating a mission statement, which then was approved by the session, and they are still active today in many different ways. But the first issue that they focused on was this issue of gun violence prevention. And you may remember that a couple of years ago, there was a presbytery event held at Webster Grove that everybody was invited to. And the speaker was Deanna Hollis, the new gun violence prevention minister for our denomination, who is part of the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship. Following up on that, then the advocacy team took a motion to session to do what Stony Point did, which is to put up signs that indicate that Webster Grove is a gun-free zone. So Janice, I don't know if you can somehow get my picture up so I can show this sign, just so people can see. Okay. Can you focus on me for just a minute, or are you? Anyway, this is the sign that that Webster Groves Presbyterian Church has on all their doors. It says, "Love your neighbor, Matthew 19:19, gun-free zone." And then at the bottom, it says, "Individuals other than active law enforcement officers are prohibited from carrying guns onto this property by action of the session, August 2019. Did this cause controversy within the Webster Groves congregation and session? Yes. Was there conversation? Yes. Were there educational opportunities for people to gather and talk about this and express their opinion? Yes. And After that process and after the session voted, these signs are very small. It's not a big deal in terms of, it's not the first thing you see, but it was a way that a church wanted to, in some way, take a stand around this whole issue of gun violence. So those are just some stories of how congregations have dealt with this. And the key is education. The key is debate and dialogue. The key is getting people to tell stories. The key is to be tuned into the larger community. And because there is so much violence in the St. Louis area, we have a context within our presbytery to kind of talk about this and figure out how, as Christians, can we witness to Jesus as a peacemaker through the stances that we take. So let's go back to the slides and go to the next slide. So, and again, this is all going to be on the website because this is a lot of information, but you heard Jan or Harder talk about the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship. You can just Google it, Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, up pops their website, and then you go under their who are we, and they have a whole section on gun violence prevention that has all the resources that she was talking about. They have a wonderful toolkit. It's a 70-page gun violence prevention congregational toolkit that you can download for free, or you can order it in print. And in this resource, they have 70 pages of educational and an outline for an adult education class, resources for small group conversations, that kind of thing. And then they also have on, so that's a really wonderful free resource that your mission committee or your pastor or your education committee or your as an individual, that you can just download and just leaf through it and see what possibilities might exist for you to begin the conversation if you haven't already in your congregation. You can also email GVP, Gun Violence Prevention, at Presby Peace Fellowship. The peace is misspelled. It should be PEACE, but anyway, but all of that is on their website, including this congregational toolkit. You may remember that Jan Orr Harder talked about a film called Trigger. Again, this is a film that was produced by the Presbyterian Disaster Assistance based on their interventions in various mass shooting sites. And it's geared toward congregational members and actions. And you can have access to that on the Presbyterian Disaster Assistance website. I've just read that they are going to update that film this year. And that was used both in Hudson River, and it was also used at Webster Grove as part of their educational process of talking about this issue. The Garden to Guns program. I hope that you could imagine what she was talking about. Again, all the information is on the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship website. But what happens, this is what could happen in this presbytery. We could decide as a presbytery that we're going to take on the Garden to Guns project. And so then what would happen is we would get trained over Zoom by the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship in a very simple process of going through how to build this campaign. She suggested, or maybe 2 or 3 congregations could get together. Maybe all the city churches could decide on one parking lot. And then what would happen is that you would work with your local leaders, but mostly figure out how to tell the story and communicate that you are going to receive in the parking lot on a particular morning any guns that people want to get rid of. No strings attached, no records kept, no record looked at, just a way that people can get rid of guns that they don't want and don't know what to do with. And then there's a process after that of taking those guns and literally with sledgehammers, taking them apart, melting them down, and turning them into garden tools. Guns to Gardens. Yes, thank you, Beth. I see that. Gunstogardens.org. So anyway, that's It's an active hands-on project. I don't think that it would be, this could happen if there wasn't some education done first, but it's something very active, and it's a way congregations might be able to work together. And it is, I think there are several dozen congregations across the country that have already done this. And it's part of a larger organization that the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship is connected with. So Thurza is saying Light for the Darkness would like to take a lead in this. So that's just heads up to people. So that's something. The other thing, I know some churches like to have book studies. He died a few years ago, this absolutely wonderful, funny, Southern, energetic pastor named Jim Atwood. He was a pastor in National Capital Presbytery, avid hunter and gun owner. And he became absolutely impassioned about this issue. And when he retired, he gave all of his energy to this issue. And he has written a book called Gundamentalism and Where It Is Taking America. It's about 3 or 4 years old. And it would be a wonderful book for a group of people in a church to read and talk about as a way of perhaps lighting a fire or getting some energy around this issue. So, and there are a lot of books out there, but that one's written by a good old boy Presbyterian pastor who I think he received the Peace Fellowship Peacemaker Award several years ago for his incredible work. And then in addition to all the resources on the PresbyterianPeaceFellowship.org/gun violence page, there are also our denominational policies, which Jan was referring to. And you can find those. The website is there. And also start there and you can type in and come up with the policies. Those policies are about 10 years old. So the ones that Jan was talking about can actually be found on pcbiz.org from this last General Assembly. But if you need information about that, I can get you more. I did not put it on the slide. So those are just some specific ways that congregations might get started. I think that it's important to take a pulse of where your congregation is, realizing there's going to be opinion all across the spectrum, but perhaps trying to start with, what does our scriptures say? What did Jesus say? What are our denominational policies? And how can we find, as gun owners and non-gun owners, common ground, not to fight the Second Amendment, but in order to have safer and preventative actions. So let's go to the next slide, a couple more, and then we'll open this up for conversation. The other thing that you heard Jan talk about, and I know some of you are already involved, Moms Demand Action is a national organization founded after Sandy Hook, merged with Everytown for Gun Safety in 2014, which is former Mayor Bloomberg's organization. Missouri has 17 chapters of Moms Demand Action, and St. Louis is the biggest chapter of all and is growing regularly, daily. So what does Moms Demand Action do? And by the way, you can be a dad or a non-parent or a child and still belong to Moms Demand Action. It's just that it was founded by a bunch of moms. They focus heavily on education, have all kinds of resources on their website. Their big thing is every year they get a busload, and I think last year it was something like 75, more than that, hundreds of people showed up in Jeff City on their advocacy day in order to advocate for sensible gun laws and gun control. They have successfully, up until now, lobbied across the state and got people to write in, and have lobbied our leaders in Jeff City to, although it passed one of the houses, it did not pass the other, in order to lift gun restrictions in schools, in churches, and in sensitive places. It's expected that that will come up again, and so they're constantly lobbying around that issue. Around election time, they always support gun sense candidates, and there's a website that shows you how to do that. Their meetings are the first Thursday of every month at 7 o'clock, both on Zoom and in person. If you want to join moms, all you do is text READY in caps to 64433. And they will respond and give you the ways that you can do that. I have a Facebook page, Moms Demand Action MO. So all of that, and that's a way that in this local community, you can connect with people from other churches, from schools, Black people, white people, old people, young people, rich people, poor people. It's a very eclectic, mixed group of activists who are really focused on this issue, and would be a wonderful resource if you wanted to have a speaker come into your adult education class or to preach in your pulpit. This next one doesn't really, I'm going to get myself a glass of water. Why don't you all write questions or comments on the chat, and I'll be right back. Okay, the final thing on this slide, Nicholas Kristof was a columnist for the New York Times. He quit to go run for governor of Oregon and then wasn't allowed to run. But in any case, he has done a lot of work on this issue. And every time there was a mass shooting for about 5 years, he would publish his extensive report on the New York Times. Incredible statistics, lots of information about suicide, and very uplifting, practical ways to respond. And so I just Google Nicholas Kristof, how to win an argument about guns, New York Times, and it'll pop right up. So let's go to the next, I think it's is it the last slide, the next one? One of the initiatives of Moms Demand Action is the called Be Smart program. And members of moms go into PTAs in schools in St. Louis County and in St. Louis to talk about this issue of gun violence and how to be safe in our homes with our children. It's geared at parents. It's geared in very simple ways. So at SMART, and this is what they suggest. Secure guns in your home and your vehicle. And then they talk about how you can get gun locks at your local police station, other ways to secure guns. M, model responsible behavior. If there are guns in your home, if you are a gun owner, obviously model responsible behavior. And we all know this, but it's still important to remind people. And they go into urban schools as well as suburban schools in order to share this message. A, ask about unsecured guns in other homes. This one, I think, a little, I thought to myself, I never asked when my kids went to play at a neighbor's house if there was a gun in their home, but that's what they're suggesting. And, it's something to think about. R, recognize the risks of teen suicide and tell our peers to be smart. So a very simple way of trying to have some sense around guns. So why don't we go back to the screen, the gallery screen. And if people want to ask questions or make responses, let's put the whole gallery up and raise your hand, or you can do that by going down to, is it reactions? And just raise your hand, or just put your hand up in the air and we'll acknowledge you and you can talk. Oh my goodness. Joy is sharing her own story. Joy, do you want to talk about this out loud?
Yes, I will. It took me a long time to be able to talk about it. Our son was adopted. He had lived with us for 10 years. He was active in the community. He was a deacon at the church. He babysat for our pastors. He was a person that lots of kids his age came to for advice, and he shared it. However, he was depressed in a way that we did not understand at the time. He had done all the gun safety classes. He was a hunter. He knew all of what you should do, but he also knew where the guns were in our house because he helped store them. And yeah, April 19th, 1995, he put a gun in his mouth in our living room, pulled the trigger, and did not survive. So it's been a long time, but it still comes back over and over and over again. And when people say it's something only for troubled families, let me tell you, we were not a troubled family. And we did counseling because we had adopted children and we knew we needed to do that. So survivor guilt is a big thing. And I'd rather no one else had to go through that. So gun locks, gun safety, I'm all for not even having guns in your house, but I know that there are people who do, but please be safe with them.
Joy, what a gift for you to have the courage and the kindness to share that story with us. I can't imagine the pain, not only of the moment, but the pain that you continue to carry with you. But it's those kinds of stories that are so real. And again, 60% of the 44,000 who died last year, 60% were suicides. And suicide is now either the first or second cause of death among teenage boys in this nation. So it's a real issue, which obviously moves in the direction of mental health and those kind and all of those kinds of issues. And what are we doing in our schools? But anyway, thank you, Joy.
It's also a leading cause of death in 5 to 8-year-olds.
Is it?
So.
Thank you. Anybody else want to share or ask a question or give any responses or share some resources? I'm not seeing any. Yeah, Janice?
So I would just like some feedback from what other people think about this. 3 days ago, a Texas federal judge said that someone under indictment for a felony stalking or harassment and has an ex parte, you cannot remove their guns from them because that violates their rights. And so I'm not sure how that's addressed if you have been stalked, harassed, and threatened, and there is an ex parte, which is a great tool. However, if someone still has availability of guns in their presence, I don't know if anyone's, I own many guns, but I also know the trajectory of a gun. You can shoot a gun, several hundred yards away from someone. You don't have to be close. And so that I'm not sure I understand, like, how can we address that? Like because that's a difference. It's not addressing the gun issue. It's actually addressing the gun plus this issue, that kind of thing.
Does anybody have a response to that? I mean, again, there are, I suppose some research could find out if other states, I mean, again, the image at the beginning of the car of, cars had no restrictions and no licensing and nothing. And then over the years, we've learned how to have our cars be safe. And, first it was equipment, and then it was seat belts, and now it's car seats, and now it's bags. And so the research keeps getting better and better as to how to make things safe, but still allow them to happen. And so I'm sure somebody has given some thought to that, but I can't answer that. Anybody else have any response? Are you all doing things in your churches around this issue or studying it? What would happen if you did? Anybody want to?
I've preached on it, and I've lost some parishioners, but I think that it's more important to preach on it and have people walk out or leave the church than to not preach on it.
I think for me, the statistics that this is not gun owners versus non-gun owners. I mean, what Janice just shared, that they have guns in their home. That's not the issue. The issue is how responsible we can be around our children and keeping them safe. So I think people think when we bring this up that we're talking about gun control and doing away with the Second Amendment. Some on the screen may indeed want that to happen. That is not the stance of this conversation tonight, nor is it the stance of our denomination. It's gun sensible laws and gun sense in terms of storage and safety and children. So I remember in that story about Hudson River Presbytery adopting the overture that then went to the General Assembly to begin the denominational conversation about this. There was a very active member of Presbytery, wonderful woman, who is a police officer. And she saw this as anti-law enforcement. And so we had to slow things down and have that conversation publicly to allow that voice to be heard and to say, no, this is not anti-law enforcement. This has to do with safety, and this has to do with training and being cautious and careful with one another. And, you know, and then she talked about how many law enforcement people are in favor of more gun restrictions because they see themselves as being victims of rampant gun violence and have a hard time controlling guns on the street. So, you know, even within law enforcement, it's a very mixed conversation. And so the nuances have to kind of be teased out. From Ryan. Just a shout out for another of James Atwood's books, America and Its Guns, a theological expose. That was his first book. And that is really better in terms of the theology and why we should care as Christians. The second one is more a look at how its fundamentalism, obviously of a fundamentalism, has become such a core value in a destructive way in many parts of the country. So, you know, it's a continuation, but he's the best Christian expert on this issue that I know of, for sure. Anybody else want to say anything? I'm not, let's see, any hands? I'm not seeing anything. Okay, well, if you have questions, again, this whole presentation and the PowerPoint will be on the website. And I think that Janice is going to mail out a link to everybody who's part of this tonight, so you can have access to that information. And if you have particular questions or comments or concerns or rebuttals that you would like to address toward me, feel free. You can call me or you can email me, srandrews1015@gmail.com. And I now am going to hand the ball back to Ryan, who is going to talk about next steps. Oh,
I think Jesse had something he would like to add.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think that Ryan was going to acknowledge you, but okay. Go ahead.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. Go ahead, Jesse.
Yes, oh, go ahead, Jesse.
Ryan, do you want to say something first?
Oh, no, I just wanted to introduce Jesse.
Okay.
As I listened to the presentation, Susan, to me, the starting point would be education. Taking into consideration, shall we say, your knowledge of this presbytery and our congregations in this presbytery, what would you suggest as a starting point to get a movement started in this presbytery?
Well, again, the Gun Violence Prevention Congregational Toolkit that is on the Presbyterian Peacemaking Fellowship website is a 70-page document that includes concrete suggestions for how to begin education around this issue. And it has class outlines and that kind of things. So people can download that or order it for $12. And that would be a place that perhaps your team would want to each get a copy of that, look through it and say, is there anything here that, we can do together? So that's one suggestion. The other, again, would be to get perhaps have somebody begin by lifting up some of the biblical foundation for this issue, and then show the movie Trigger, which is easily accessible. And then what would you follow that up with? And then have somebody from Moms Demand Action come in and talk about the situation here in St. Louis. So that would be one way. You could do that over a couple of weeks, or do it all in an hour and a half, or whatever. So I mean, that would be one or any of those things would be a place to start.
What was the first one? I was trying to listen and not write.
Okay, the Gun Violence Prevention Congregational Toolkit.
Okay.
That's on the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship website.
Okay.
And it's a PDF you can download.
Okay.
Did you have anything else you wanted to say, Jesse?
No,
It was your team that suggested that we do something around gun violence, and we were going to do it at a Presbyterian gathering, and then that did not work, and so we decided to do it in this venue.
I think that a lot of material was shared here tonight, and I'm hoping that those who are present will take this back to their own congregations. And also, we in Public Witness, we will start a process of, shall we say, looking at gun safety violence and working with organizations like Moms Demand Action, etc., and to try to get a movement started within our presbytery, because there is such a great need. And I visualize that with what's happening in our economy, etc., that this need is going to grow. And I think that we need to, shall we say, start trying to get a handle on this as much as we can. As I listened to you, I was thinking of a title, Presbyterians for Gun Safety, or something to that effect. But
right.
I think we can do something with it. And I think we all, if we work together, we can make some progress. It's not going to be easy because, as you say, they're always going to tie it into, you're trying to take my gun away from me, Second Amendment, etc. But I think by starting with the educational viewpoint and being careful about the wordage that we use, I think we may be able to make some progress in this presbytery. I'd like to hear from
Janice is saying she will make a link in the weekly e-news to the website where this presentation will be. And she's also going to make a link to maybe both to Peacemaking Fellowship and to the Presbyterian, the denominational resources, which I believe are in the peacemaking section of the, I don't know. It's confused. You can find them.
Yeah.
They're there. But anyway, but again, I have this, not that this will happen, but I'm going to pick on Travis because he said that Second Church is interested in doing something. I have this vision of Westminster, Second, First, and Trinity deciding that they're going to do a Guns to Garden Saturday in the spring and get a little team together to plan that and figure out how to do the necessary education in their congregations in order to get people to come together to do this, and then get the local news to come and cover that event so that it'll be around the area, and people will be seeing Presbyterians for Gun Safety. Great title. Is it lifting up this idea that people can indeed get rid of guns they don't need or want instead of having them sit around. And that they can be transformed into something that is creative for God's creation. I think it's a wonderful image. It's not going to take a whole lot of guns off the street, but it's a witness. It's a public witness. That's a sign and a metaphor of who we are called to be. So I mean that, or, get some of the West County churches together to do it. I don't know. It probably would be more fun if it was more than just one congregation.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you just laid out a plan that we can work on. Yeah.
On that note, Susan, thank you for the presentation, and I am very excited to lean into the Guns to Gardens initiative and have been already preaching on that imagination and implementing something like that in St. Louis. And so if anyone else is interested, whether your congregation is in the city or somewhere else, in our presbytery, but feel a similar sense of passion around that, I'd love to coordinate and help, spearhead something that can bear fruit in that way together. So thank you for offering that as a particular tangible action that we can put our hands to live into that shalom vision. Thank you very much.
And Travis, I will be talking with you as to how we can move forward with those 4 congregations, which is ideal.
I also see Alan sitting there from Oak Hill. I'm just thinking of churches that are sort of close together, but anyway.
Yeah.
And again, I think that if you contacted somebody, Jan or Harder or somebody, they can tell you how other churches have done this, because there are clusters of churches in different places around the country that have already done this Guns to Garden process, and to learn what were their steps and how long did it take and was it successful. Anyway, I think it's a fun idea. So
Sounds good. Okay, Ryan, that was my participation.
Thank you. Yes, I had told Jesse earlier today that I want to make sure that Public Witness and your team were seen and recognized for your work today. Public Witness team was the one who queued up this conversation, and they've been charged with queuing up more conversations. Our speaker theme moving into the whole next year is Public Witness. So there's going to be momentum around organizing action, around networking each other, with finding each other and discussing what we can do in very real and concrete ways in the community. So I want to thank Jesse and the Public Witness team for taking the lead on that. I want to thank Reverend Dr. Susan Andrews for answering very concretely that question that was eluding me for a response for a while of what can we do. Well, I can't leave here today without knowing that yes, there are things that we can do for sure. So thank you for that gift. Thank you for that focus. And I'm leaving with a sense of feeling inspired with hope, and that there are things that we can unite our resources around and do together as a presbytery and even on the local church level. So I want to give one final thank you to the Public Witness team and to Reverend Dr. Susan Andrews, and also to our friend and colleague. I want to make sure yes, Reverend Jan or Harder from afar. Thank you so much coming in.
Ryan, I'm going to thank her, but if you dropped her an email, I think that would mean a lot from you.
Absolutely.
If you were willing to do that. Okay, good. And I want to thank Janice McMillan, who was our tech guru and made this happen. So I'm so grateful to you. And I hope you noticed Ellen Gernon did write on the chat room that she's very involved in this issue in the Cape Girardeau area and has worked with other clergy. So some resources there. Thank you, Ellen, for sharing that. So, all right, friends, we are called to be peacemakers, to build God's reign of shalom, and to figure out how to do that with our brothers and sisters in Christ. So let us go and love the Lord and love one another and make a difference. Peace be with you. Bye-bye.